Paul & Wilcox acknowledges the traditional custodians of the lands on which this podcast is recorded. We pay our respects to their elders, past and present, and to all First Nations people joining us today.
Hello and welcome to the first episode in our Beyond Compliance Leading Through Workplace Change podcast series, where we'll be discussing the key issues leaders in workplaces around Australia are grappling with right now. Whether you're navigating workplace change and disruption, restructures and redundancies, managing psychosocial hazards and complaints, or leading workplaces through transformation, we've got you covered. I'm Faye Calderoni, a partner in our employment team and co-leader of our Beyond Compliance offering to boards and executives, and I'm your host for this series. Today, I am very excited to be joined by my colleagues in our National Employment Team, Special Counsel Piers Mitchell from Melbourne, and our partner from the West Coast in Perth, Rosemary Roach. Welcome.
Thank you, Faye.
Today we're discussing restructures and redundancies. When is a redundancy really genuine? With restructures increasing, redundancies are being challenged more often. The question becomes, where do employers often trip up, and how can you run a restructure that holds up legally while also treating people with compassion and dignity during these tough times? Let's start with you, Rosie, to break down the basics for us. What does genuine redundancy actually mean under the Fair Work Act and more broadly?
Okay then, thanks Faye. It will not be a surprise to anyone, but simply calling something a redundancy does not mean that it is a redundancy. Put simply, a position will be redundant when an employer no longer requires the job to be done by anyone. This can be because a role is eliminated, or there's been a reduction in the number of roles required, or a reallocation of duties. And in this regard, just because an employee's duties are reallocated, it does not mean that their role is not redundant. The changes can come about because of restructures, downturns, automation, outsourcing, business closures and sale of business. And of course, there's a lot of speculation at the moment about what role AI will play in making roles redundant. Ultimately, it's important that the focus is on the role and not the person, and redundancies should always be supported by a sound business rationale or business case. Now, why does the distinction matter? There's a few things as to why it matters. If there is a genuine redundancy, this will trigger entitlements to redundancy payments under the Fair Work Act, and sometimes far more generous entitlements under an enterprise agreement or policy. There's favourable tax treatments for genuine redundancy payments, so it's important that employers, when making those payments, are confident that the role is redundant. We sometimes hear in settlements employees say, just say that my role is redundant, and that's not going to cut it with the tax office if in fact the role is not redundant, and the employer could be exposed to penalties. And it will also, if there are genuine redundancies, trigger consultation under awards and enterprise agreements. And then importantly, there's a concept of a genuine redundancy under the Fair Work Act, which can then provide an employer with a defence to any unfair dismissal claim that's made by an employee whose employment is terminated as a result of redundancy. And so for that test, to meet a test of genuine redundancy for the purposes of that defence, the employer will have to establish that the role is no longer needed due to operational change, that they've complied with any consultation obligations under the award or agreement, and finally that they've considered all reasonable redeployment opportunities for the employee.
Thanks so much, Rosie. Such a great summary of everything employers have to be across. And it really is not just a quick box ticking exercise or something that you just call something a redundancy and think that you can get it over the line. Okay, Rosie, you mentioned actually there the importance of consultation. Let's unpack that a bit more. Does it matter if employees are covered by an award or an enterprise agreement?
It It does, Faye. Consultation obligations will be set out in awards and enterprise agreements, and consultation obligations are broader, but you would expect they will always be triggered by a redundancy process where it will trigger a major workplace change. And again, the importance of complying with consultation is because it will set up that defence potentially to any unfair dismissal claim, but it is a process that you are expected to go through with your employees and their representatives, if they want their representatives, such as their union representatives involved, to go through, to put them on notice of the changes that are coming up, to explain the changes, and in this case, the redundancies and the effects that it will have on their particular roles. And then to discuss with employees, and again, their representatives, if they're in the room, about what steps you can take to minimise or reduce the potential adverse consequences for employees, to invite responses from the employees, seek out their views, and to genuinely consider their feedback. So it is an important process because it's a defence to an unfair dismissal claim. It's a requirement under awards and agreements, and if you fail to comply, you could be exposed to, again, contraventions of the Fair Work Act and potentially penalties. But it's also a good business practice because you're going to avoid taking employees by surprise. You're going to give them the benefit of sharing your thinking and also seeking their views. And sometimes in employees putting forward their views, they may have proposals that you may not have thought about in terms of how you could avoid making particular roles redundant. It may be that they're prepared to do some job sharing or reduce their hours, which can maintain them in employment. So from that perspective, we'd say even if it's an employee is not covered by an award or enterprise agreement, it is good business practice to go through that process in any event with all employees so that they're put on notice. There's an opportunity to genuinely discuss what's happening and what the alternatives are.
So true, Rosie. It's more than just a box ticking exercise and just ensures dignity and compassion in a process that you may have to do, but you can do it better.
Exactly.
If you're having that conversation. All right, let's talk about redeployment now. We often get told, oh, we've offered them, we've given them a list of the jobs that are available, and that's sufficient, isn't it, for redeployment purposes? It's not really, isn't it?
Probably not, Faye, probably not. There's a couple of things around redeployment. There's a lot to consider in redeployment. It's not a requirement to put an employee into any vacant role that you have. It's not a requirement to create a role, for example, but there is a requirement for employers to genuinely consider what roles are available within their business and their broader business. So not only in the particular location and not only in their immediate enterprise, but their associated entities, and to have regard to the skills and experience of the employee and what roles they could perform that are available, and perhaps even if the employee could perform that role if they were given some additional support and training. And it's something to offer the employee. And again, it goes back to avoiding those adverse effects of redundancy programs so that an employee can remain in employment. Now, in terms of how far do you actually need to go, as I said, you don't have to create a role for an employee. But there has been some recent decisions, and as far as the High Court, that have examined if the Commission is looking into how far does an employer need to go to tick the redeployment aspect of the unfair dismissal defence, then the Commission can look at what changes an employer might make to their existing structures to open up redeployment opportunities. And in the particular case that the High Court was looking at, it was about whether you could stop the use of some contractors and basically insource some work to avoid redundancies. Now, the courts have been at pains to say that's not always going to be reasonable for an employer to have to go through that process and, restructure the way they go about doing their business. But it does, I think, put employers on notice that there is an expectation that you will look more broadly and think more broadly. And perhaps in order to avoid making your employees redundant, you'll think about what restructures you might be able to do more broadly. So in terms of what's best practice looks like, we think that it goes to giving a genuine assessment as to whether an employee can fill the role, even with a little retraining, having regard to their skills and experience and what roles you have available, documenting that process, discussing the alternatives with the employee, and also, and I guess this is linked hand in hand with the consultation process, genuinely considered any alternatives that they may come up with. It doesn't mean that you have to ultimately agree with the alternatives, but give it thought before you dismiss it out of hand. Now, there's positives, of course, from actually thinking about redeployment. We always think of these things, I think, sometimes in the negative. If you redeploy an employee, you find that role for them, they maintain their employment, and the employer avoids the need to make or to bring their employment to an end and make redundancy payments. Also, if you have gone through a careful process and you've offered suitable alternative roles, and it is a large restructure, it may open up the opportunity for the employer to make an application to the Fair Work Commission for an order that they don't have to make the redundancy payment to the employee because they have offered a suitable alternative role. And in those circumstances, if the Commission agrees that the employee was offered a role which was suitable and they could have maintained their employment, then in those circumstances, the Commission can say, well, either not entitled to redundancy payment or will reduce the redundancy payment you would otherwise be paid. So it is an important process, again, because it gives you that defence, it gives you other options, but also it's a way of actually maintaining good people within your business, even if you want to restructure your operations.
Absolutely. Such practical tips. Thank you, Rosie. Piers, I'm going to pivot to you now and talk about when things go wrong, as they sometimes will in the world that is the workplace. What are the common triggers for the Fair Work Commission or a court to look behind a redundancy and scrutinise whether it was genuine?
Yeah, thanks, Faye. Look, if you're an employer that's landing in the Fair Work Commission or even a court where there's a redundancy being challenged, the heart of that claim and your ability to defend it is going to rely on the strength of the evidence that you have to show that the redundancy was genuine. So in answer to that question, those common triggers or red flags, as would say, tend to arise where there are things that have happened or perhaps haven't happened that might, in the employee's eyes at least, raise a doubt as to whether the redundancy was in fact genuine. So some of those red flags or the common triggers might include where the redundancy follows or coincides with a workplace complaint, a period of leave, or the exercise of some kind of workplace right. Some of the common things we tend to see are, for example, where the employee's raised a bullying claim or a bullying allegation against another employee or their manager, and then very soon after, there's a redundancy process that employee's identified for redundancy and then they're gone. Certainly, at least in the employee's eyes, there can be a link between them raising that complaint and making those allegations and then being shown the door as part of this redundancy process a short time later. If there is, in those circumstances, you can't point to clear sort of operational evidence underpinning the redundancy, then that's a common trigger or a red flag that we tend to see where there's the evidence looks like it's a little bit shaky to support the employer's case that the redundancy was genuine. Some others that we tend to see are where the selection process for redundancy is a little bit opaque or unexplained. And this goes back to that business case that Rosie has spoken about before, where it's really important to be able to show that there are underlying operational reasons that support the redundancy. And if you don't have those clearly articulated, then it's very difficult to also then go on to explain the selection process. How did you identify these employees for redundancy and why? If you can't explain that or you can't articulate it, then that can be a red flag. Another one is consultation. So where that's absent or perfunctory, there's perhaps been a rushed process or something like that. That can be something that might indicate the employer may have trouble showing that the redundancy was genuine. It's really important, as Rosie mentioned before, that if employees are covered by a modern award or an enterprise agreement, that you have followed the consultation process set out in the award or agreement. And if you can't demonstrate that, then there is a potential exposure to prosecution and penalties. And finally, where the restructure doesn't withstand logical analysis, that again ties into that business case, right? If you can't show that the restructure has occurred because of this sort of underlying operational change, then it can be very difficult to defend a redundancy as being genuine. And certainly in the employee's eyes, they're seeing things very differently. They will often say, well, it wasn't a genuine redundancy and there was some other underlying reason for them being identified and let go.
So true. I think employers often think it's the easy way out, but given the jurisdictions that we're operating in, it's far from it, and usually it means they're paying a premium and still carrying the risk. But okay, so what practical tips can you give employers to reduce the risks of these redundancies being successfully challenged?
I think the most common mistake we tend to see is where employers start with the person. And Rosie at the outset of this mentioned redundancy really is about the role and not the individual. But what we commonly see, I think, is where an employer or business, they know who they want to exit, and then they tend to build in the redundancy after that, or reverse engineer it, if you like. And that sequencing can be the root cause, I think, of most successful challenges to redundancy processes. If you flip the order, then you dramatically reduce your risk. And by that I mean, I'll identify three main points that follow from that. The first is, it's really important, again, to start with that business case. So before anyone's name is mentioned, the decision makers in the business should really be able to articulate in writing what has changed in the operational requirements of the business. Is it a loss of contract? Is it a decline in revenue, a technology change that eliminates certain tasks or jobs, a restructure and change in reporting lines? Whatever it is, write it down clearly and contemporaneously before identifying affected employees for redundancy. The second point, or the second step, is to then identify the affected roles and not the affected people. The redundancy really must be of a position and not a person. So if your internal discussions, emails, board papers, management meeting minutes and so on refer to the individual by name before they refer to their role or function, then you potentially have a sequencing problem that might be difficult to explain in cross-examination. So that's a really important step. And then the third one is to apply a transparent process. So that goes back to consultation, selection criteria, if that's applicable, considering the redeployment options. These things all flow, I think, from from a well-documented business rationale. And if you've done all of that work at the front end, then each of those steps becomes far easier to execute genuinely rather than as a box ticking exercise. Yeah. And at the end of the day, if you do find yourself challenged in court or in the Fair Work Commission as to the redundancy process, you can rely on all of that. It's going to give you a really strong basis to buttress your case and answer any allegations that this process hasn't been genuine.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much, Piers, and thank you to you both for joining us today. And thank you everyone for tuning in. As always, please get in touch with us. If you have any questions arising from today's podcast, you can find our details on our website, which is hallandwilcox.com.au, or connect with us on LinkedIn. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please rate, review, or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again, and we'll catch you next time.
This podcast is not legal advice and should not be relied upon as such. You should always obtain legal advice about your specific circumstances.